This is the 2015 training for the Fairington Christmas Outreach with City for the Nations. Thank you for deciding to take a part of this, as well as viewing this short training. This training will focus on the history that City for the Nations has with the Fairington apartment complex. It will also talk about what it means for this opportunity to be missions focused. At the same time, it will also provide some background on the Iraqi and Bhutanese refugees that you'll be interacting with, as well as provide some details for the outreach. Our partnership with the Fairington apartment complex began in November 2014 when a friend of the ministry began an English as a second language program there for the refugees who lived there. When City for the Nations learned about his efforts, we immediately asked if we would be able to participate with him, and since then we've expanded the program to include about a half dozen volunteers meeting weekly on Fridays. That opportunity quickly expanded to doing a number of outreaches in the Fairington community, specifically a number of outreaches that happened over the summer of 2015. Off of those initiatives, a woman at one of the churches that we partner with also began to offer a sewing class to refugee women, meaning that ultimately we have a wide array of interactions that we've had with the Fairington apartment complex over the past year or so. So let's talk about who that relationship has been with. The Fairington apartment complex houses a wide range of individuals, such as refugees from Iraq and Bhutan, as well as a lot of individuals who are native Lexingtonians, especially those who tend to be sort of on the lower end of income scales. However, we have a friendly relationship with the administration of the apartment complex, meaning that we have the freedom to kind of come and go as we desire and to work with whatever populations that they see that we are able to meaningfully help. So now let's talk about what it means for us to be missions focused in our outreach at the Fairington apartment complex. Our focus is on the nations that exist at Fairington, especially those individuals who belong to the nations of Iraq and Bhutan, who God has brought to Lexington through the refugee program. This means that although we are more than excited to work with all the individuals who live in the Fairington apartment complex, and of course invite you to work alongside and work lovingly with those individuals as well, they aren't our primary focus. And even though they'll be receiving gifts through the Christmas basket program and will also be invited to participate at the Christmas parties that we're throwing, they again won't be the primary focus of our efforts. Missions work is never easy, so we want you to have realistic expectations going in. First, this is an amazing opportunity to shine the light of Jesus, and that's going to be something that we especially emphasize, is just loving on the individuals who are at the Fairington apartment complex. Furthermore, this is an amazing opportunity because we have the opportunity to love these individuals while being visibly and explicitly coming in the name and love of God and Christ. Meaning that ultimately we have an opportunity to be ministering, and even though it's not very likely that any individuals will be coming to Christ in this exact moment, there's such an opportunity to simply be ministering and to be witnessing in His name in this context. That said, we want to caution you. For a lot of individuals who end up participating in activities and outreaches like this, there can be a temptation to transform the people that are trying to be helped into projects. Now, those projects can take a lot of different forms in the minds of the individuals, whether it's a way to learn evangelism or maybe a way of making up for feeling guilty about not evangelizing in their personal lives, or perhaps having some kind of condescending idea towards who these individuals who are refugees are. Ultimately, we have to reject this notion and understand that the individuals that we are dealing with are people made in the image of God, with whom we can have long-term meaningful relationships with, and who we are capitalizing on those relationships for the kingdom of God. With those warnings standing, let's talk a bit about the refugees that we'll be interacting with. One of the groups is a large group of Iraqi refugees. Now, Iraqis are overwhelmingly Muslims. Now, what that means is that they perceive that they worship a God named Allah, which is the Arabic word for God. And it's the same word that Christians and Jews who speak Arabic as their first language use in their own worship. This, as well as certain statements in the Quran, cause Muslims to believe that they worship an unfiltered or pure version of the same God that Christians and Jews worship. In other words, they believe that they worship the same God as Christians, but they simply worship a more factually correct version of that same God. Muslims believe that they worship God primarily through actions rather than through doctrine. They may emphasize things such as praying regularly, being charitable as much as they can, and actions like taking pilgrimage if they're able to. Most Muslims are also familiar with the name Jesus, or as they would say in Arabic, Isa. They consider him, as you might have guessed, not as God or the Son of God, but as an incredibly important prophet. And while they obscure many of the realities about his identity, they do understand many core truths. Like, for instance, the fact that he lived a sinless life and had ultimately many disciples, and that his actions are recorded in the four Gospels. This commonality of understanding, to some degree at least, the nature of Jesus can be a great starting point for conversations with Muslims, especially since, unlike most Americans, most individuals who grew up in the Arab world aren't skittish about talking about religion. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes, though. In addition to being Muslim, there are a few other things that we need to know about the Iraqi population living in the Fairington apartment complex. Iraq is a place of intense cultural modesty, and this can be seen by, for the example, that many women choose to wear the hijab. In addition, you can also expect to see more clear and delineated gender roles than what many Americans may be used to. The Iraqi refugee population is also likely to have a moderate amount of English proficiency, or sometimes even better. That's because many Iraqis did study English when they were growing up in school, and may have continued to speak English if they ended up in a position of business or education related fields. Along those same lines, many of the individuals who are coming from Iraq have a relatively robust history of education and work. So don't be surprised if you encounter refugees who have a bachelor's degree or perhaps higher. Now that you have a bit of background information about Iraqi refugees, let's go over some quick do's and don'ts. Remember, Iraqis have some pretty strict gender norms, so be cognizant when you're dealing with someone of the same or opposite gender. Men, greet other men with a firm handshake. Women, you can also greet other women with a handshake, but don't be surprised if they hug or kiss you, especially on the cheek. When dealing with someone of the opposite gender, you can either 1. Wait to see what they do, because many Iraqis have different opinions about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, or greet them by saying hello and placing your hand on your chest. Keeping in mind that most Iraqis are generally more open to talking about things about faith and religion than most Americans are, feel free to talk openly about your faith in and love for Jesus, especially associating that with your love of God. However, don't try to argue with them about whether or not Jesus is the divine Son of God. While they may be willing to engage with this, that's not the point of this mission, and we anticipate that as individuals in this population come to Christ, it will be the Spirit convincing them of the identity of Jesus, not us. Other conversations that you might have with an Iraqi refugee might be about the story of their life and how they came to America in the first place. Many of these refugees have very interesting stories that involve a lot of career choices in their life, as well as a very interesting aspect of the entire refugee process itself. However, it can be tempting when hearing these stories to begin talking about the political issues surrounding the current refugee crisis. This is something best to avoid. First, because the crisis largely deals with Syrian refugees, and these refugees are from Iraq, but also because this conversation is likely to be confusing to anyone not very familiar with the American political system. Finally, absolutely do look for opportunities to talk about the gospel, but don't make every conversation an attempt to find a way to sneak the gospel in. After all, these individuals are people made in the image of God. They're worth having relationships and friendships with, and that needs to be something that we all keep on our mind throughout this outreach. Now let's talk a bit about the Bhutanese refugees. In terms of religion, they're a bit more complicated than the Iraqi refugees, or at least harder to nail down. While most Bhutanese refugees that you encounter will likely be some form of Hindu, it is not impossible that you may encounter a Buddhist amongst them. Either way, Their form of religion is very likely to be influenced by folk religion or animist ideals. As such, they're likely to believe that gods or godlike spirits reside in all things around them. Furthermore, Bhutanese refugees are also likely to have very limited English proficiency because their home nation of Bhutan had almost no infrastructure for teaching English. Furthermore, many refugees come to America without being able to read or write in their own language. That being the case, there are some special do's and don'ts for dealing with Bhutanese refugees. First, be sure to speak slowly and clearly, and preferably with a less elevated vocabulary to try to accommodate for the fact that many of them are learning English for the first time. However, don't let this cause you to assume that they are unintelligent. Instead, just realize that if you and I were dropped into the middle of a Bhutanese village, we would probably also be struggling to understand what others were saying. This limited proficiency, as well as their own cultural norms, will cause them to respond to acts of kindness largely with some kind of symbolic gesture. Feel free to respond kindly to this gesture, but don't give verbal praise of the things that they possess, such as commenting on liking something that they have in their home or that they have with them. It is considered typical in the culture to give possessions that someone else praises and likes to that individual. And of course, that isn't something that we want to have happening during this outreach. So, focus on being friendly and acting in the name of God, showing your love to these individuals so that they associate Christians with their needs being provided in God's name. However, don't try to talk through a lot of spiritual issues. Their limited English proficiency will often make these conversations more confusing than helpful. Instead, we're relying on individuals that we've identified within the Bhutanese refugee population who do speak some amount of English to hopefully become people of peace in the coming years. Now that we know who we'll be working with, let's talk about what we'll actually be doing. All of these outreaches will begin by gathering at 3501 Laredo Drive. It's sort of a community center for the Fairington apartment complex. Now, there will be 4 opportunities to actually be able to interact with the populations at Fairington. The first 2 will be parties on Wednesday and Thursday. On Wednesday, setup will begin at noon, and the party itself will last from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Similarly, on Thursday, setup will begin at 3, and the party will go from 3:30 to 4:30. The goal of these parties is to distribute age-appropriate gifts to children and allow these children to experience a time of play and enjoyment over the Christmas season. At the same time, we'll be using this opportunity to hopefully engage meaningfully and relationally with their parents. On Friday, we'll be gathering together at the same place at 3:30 p.m. to begin constructing Christmas baskets, which we'll then be delivering on noon the following day. This delivery process will involve us going around to the community in the Fairington apartment complex and delivering the baskets to the individuals there in a personal, direct way. And that's it. Thank you for taking the time to complete this training, and we can't wait to see you at the Christmas Outreach at Fairington.